Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of The Women and Men of American Religion, a sub-series of Religion and the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fixed, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about the podcast. In this particular sub-series, we explore the women and men who, fueled in large part by their religion, have made significant and broad contributions to the American tapestry. This helps immensely in understanding better what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion. Previous episodes include Billy Graham, Elizabeth Seton, Joseph Smith, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Today, we will get to know the life and times of Abraham Joshua Heschel, perhaps best known by the American public as the rabbi who walked alongside Reverend Martin Luther King in the famous protest march in the spring of 1965. One renowned scholar of American religion wrote this, quote, "On college and university campuses, at Christian seminaries, as well as Jewish rabbinical assemblies, at colloquies on race relations, and in the corridors of power, he spoke on the sensitive and difficult problems of the day in the best tradition of the Western conscience and of its biblical roots," close quote. To help us do this, we have with us today Susanna Heschel, the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, Chair of the Jewish Studies Program, and a faculty member of the Religion Department. Dr. Heschel received her A.B. at Trinity College and Ph.D. at the University of Pennsylvania. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish and Protestant thought during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, and the history of anti-Semitism. Her numerous publications include Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, which won a National Jewish Book Award, and the Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible in Nazi Germany. Heschel has been a visiting professor at the universities of Frankfurt and Cape Town, as well as Princeton, and she is the recipient of numerous grants, including from the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, and a year-long Rockefeller Fellowship at the National Humanities Center. She has received many honors, including the Mendelssohn Prize of the Leo Beck Institute and 5 honorary doctorates from universities in the United States, Canada, Switzerland, and Germany. Currently, she is a Guggenheim Fellow and is writing a book on the history of European Jewish scholarship on Islam. She is an elected member of the American Society for the Study of Religion and the American Academy for Jewish Research. And perhaps most importantly, Susanna is the daughter of our subject, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Susanna, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Susanna, before we get into some of the deeper questions, if you were on an elevator, and this will help our listeners, I think, sort of frame your father in this podcast episode. If you were on an elevator and a fellow traveler asked you, who was Abraham Heschel, how would you answer in like the 30 seconds that you would have?
Well, of course, I don't like to answer in 30 seconds. I'm a professor, so
Right.
even if the semester ends, it's not enough. It's just a beginning. But what are the major qualities of my father that I would want to emphasize? I would say first that he spoke as a religious Jew who gave us, in so many ways, in language we can understand, aspects of Jewish religiosity that most people seem to be unaware of. He said that Judaism is the least understood religion in the world. He also was a person for whom what we call social justice was, in fact, a religious commitment and an act itself of piety and prayer.
Okay. The doors open and your fellow traveler got off. That's great. Thank you for that. And maybe give us a quick description of your mother. How would you describe your mother?
And my mother was a very talented pianist who filled our home with music. With her practicing on the piano, she was really great. Just the other day, the Beethoven Appassionata Sonata came on the radio while I was driving. And of course, it reminded me of my mother playing that piece. I remember when I was very little, she was studying Beethoven Third Piano Concerto, and then later on the Fourth. Um, but she also played chamber music, piano trios, piano quartets, piano quintets. And as you know, the piano part in chamber music is really difficult. I did study piano and cello and had the chance to play a little bit with her and her musical colleagues in some chamber music, just a little bit, which I loved. So I'm grateful for having had the music in our home.
Okay, fantastic. I wanted to make sure we got something about your mother in this episode as well, because I'm sure she played a big role in your father's life, obviously. Susanna, can you tell us about your father's early life? We know, or I will say that he was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907. But why don't you give us sort of a description of that early life? And I'll prompt this by quoting an author who said, your father's early education was, quote, within the world of the intensive Jewish piety of Eastern European Judaism, close quote. Anyways, why don't you give us your description of that early life?
So my father was born in Warsaw, 1907, and he was the youngest of several children. His father was a Hasidic rebbe who was raised by his mother at the home of her father, who was also a famous Hasidic rebbe. My grandfather chose to live in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Jewish Warsaw. My father's mother, my grandmother, was the twin sister of another rebbe, and she was a very pious woman. Women sought the opportunity to sit next to her in the synagogue because she was inspiring to them. My father was brilliant, so brilliant that tutors were hired to teach him. And yes, he said that he grew up surrounded by people of religious nobility, which I think is a wonderful phrase, religious nobility. What does it mean to raise our children today surrounded by people of religious nobility? Do we expose them even to people we consider to be holy, people of prayer? My father was very little and already he was giving learned talks. He would be lifted up to a table and he would give learned lectures about the Torah, about the Bible. And he also was very pious, of course, and took his faith very seriously. But he was the age of 9, left without a father. My grandfather died in an influenza epidemic, he told me. Family was extremely poor. When my father was a teenager, he started also to study secular books of philosophy and history and science. And he decided finally that he wanted to go to university, which was not so unusual in those days in a Hasidic family. He went first to Vilna, where he spent a year to receive what's called the Abitur. It's like an SAT. It's a certificate that you're ready for university. So he took classes in science and math and whatever, literature, history that he needed for the exam. And he also was involved there with a group of Yiddish poets. They were called Young Vilna. And some became very well-known poets, Avram Sutzkever, for example, and Chaim Grade. My father published a volume of Yiddish poetry, which he dedicated to his father's memory. And then in 1927, he began his studies at the University of Berlin. And he used to say that Berlin at that time felt like the intellectual and cultural capital of the universe. There was so much going on, great professors and lectures and theater and concerts and poetry readings. And he went to everything, even though he was very poor. He had often to subside just on potatoes. It was all he could afford. But he immersed himself in study. My father always studied all the time. My parents didn't take vacations. Twice, I think they went to a movie, very occasionally to the theater. My mother went often to concerts, and my father would sometimes go with her. But in Berlin, he studied both at the Orthodox and Reform rabbinical seminaries because he wanted to understand how they think, both places, even though he was already ordained a rabbi before he left Warsaw. And then he finished his dissertation in December of 1932, which was about the Hebrew prophets. And the question that he asked was, what is the consciousness of the Hebrew prophets? How did they experience revelation? And he brought classical Jewish sources and interpretations to bear on those texts. And the book is also a critique of modern Protestant biblical scholarship, which he felt was missing so much of the beauty and the piety that was being expressed by the prophets, the religious experience, the religious consciousness. My father took his exams in February of 1933, just after Hitler came to power. And then he tried, of course, to get out, to get a position outside Germany. He also had to publish his dissertation in order to receive a PhD. And that took a few years because publishers in Germany wouldn't take a book by a Jew. He moved in 1936 to Frankfurt to replace Martin Buber at the Adult Jewish Education Center that Buber and Franz Rosenzweig had established. And my father taught Martin Buber how to speak modern Hebrew. But still, he tried to get out. But then in October of 1938, the Nazis arrested and deported all the Polish Jews. So my father was back in Poland and then finally was able to leave at the last minute just a few weeks before the Nazi invasion. He received a word from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati that they had a visa for him. And so he said he was plucked like a brand from the fire and arrived in the United States in March of 1940. He spent the war years in Cincinnati teaching at the seminary, the Reform Seminary. And then after the war, he moved to New York City and became a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It was the seminary of the conservative movement of Judaism, but the faculty were all very Orthodox, and so were we. Uh, we we did not pray at the synagogue, a conservative synagogue, for example, and we were very strictly observant. But that's where my father remained until his death in December of 1972.
Okay. Wow, that's a great overview of his life. Let me ask you a few questions. When he was really young, so in Warsaw, he said he was poor. His father died when he was 9 or 10. What was the family life like as far as religiously? You said he was a Hasidic Jew. Maybe help our listeners understand also where that falls in the spectrum. And so describe his early religious life, maybe in the home, briefly.
Well, a, a Hasidic religious life means, first of all, you pray 3 times a day. You go to the synagogue. Certain days you fast. Certain rituals are undertaken at home. On a festival of Sukkot, Passover, there's a Seder, 2 Seders. Um, my father also was very intensely studying Jewish religious texts that were interpretations of the Torah, but also texts of Hasidic masters, many of whom were his ancestors, that try to explain what it is, what it means to lead a religious life, what that implies for us as individuals, but also as a community, our responsibility toward one another, how to pray, how to pray with intensity. how to prepare even to begin to pray, how to experience the presence of God. God is everywhere. The whole earth is filled with God's glory. So, what can I do in order to become aware of God's presence, of God's glory? What do I need to cultivate in myself in order to have that awareness? And that's something that my father learned in Hasidic texts and brought to us in his English language books. So he starts his book, Man is Not Alone, or his book, God in Search of Man, not with some kind of proof of the existence of God, but rather by talking about human qualities such as wonder and awe, radical amazement. He talked about what we need to do to become aware of God's presence. We don't often think about wonder and awe. We sometimes take certain experiences and reduce them to banal moments. So, my father used to give lectures sometimes in the evening, and he would say to the audience, "Who just witnessed the great miracle that just happened?" And people were confused, didn't know what he meant. And he said, "The sun has just set. So, can we look at that sunset and see what a miracle it is?" When we would light Shabbat candles in our home, Shabbat comes early in the winter, late in the summer, but always just before the sun sets. We would light the candles in the dining room, and then we would go in the living room, which had windows facing west over the Hudson River in New York City, and we would watch the sunset. And the two went together. Shabbat coming in and the sun setting, and then our lighting the candles and having that pause to watch the sunset, to welcome Shabbat entering our lives.
Okay. And thank you for that. So he taught first in Cincinnati, then went to New York. And I found some authors saying that he, quote, once again found himself in the midst of the conflict between old and new, between tradition and modernity, as expressed especially in the familiar distinction between Orthodox, conservative, and Reform Judaism, close quote. Can you help our listeners understand this distinction and where your father was in that spectrum, and then how that affected his, or the significance of that in his contributions to the American project?
Well, my father never labeled himself. He never said, I am a conservative Jew, an Orthodox Jew. He never talked in those terms. He didn't like labels because, you meet the label and then you have an image that may not actually be authentic or genuine, real.
Yep.
So he didn't do that. But yes, he had a commitment to Jewish law, to Jewish observance, to prayer, to observing the Sabbath, kosher laws, celebrating Jewish festivals. Um, what would be the difference? Well, I suppose you could say, for example, there's some people who come home from work on Friday, cook dinner, go to the table, and whatever time it is, and whatever's happening in the sky, that's when they light the candles.
Okay.
On the other hand, there are those who say, we light the candles when Shabbat comes to us. We don't make Shabbat. Shabbat comes to us. So there's an anticipation. And in fact, on Fridays, sometimes a little nervousness to get everything done in time, all of the shopping and the cooking and the cleaning, the preparation. And then it's time because Shabbat comes, enters. So that would be a difference, for example.
Okay. All right. That's helpful. Um, so in 1945, he became a citizen uh, of the United States. What did this mean to him? How significant was that?
Well, uh, those first years in the United States during World War II, my father had a mother and 3 sisters in Europe who were all killed. Many extended family, friends, and colleagues. And many of them wrote to him in America and said, "Can you help me get out?" And he tried. He was at times in despair because so many Jews in America were not interested and not helpful. So that was at times terribly disheartening. He said he would pray, he would recite the Psalms. At one point, he went to a march that had been organized in Washington, D.C., of rabbis. He joined. But he said when he spoke, nobody listened to him. They didn't know who he was, they weren't interested. What could he do? So you can imagine how much that hurt. At the end of the war, he had hope that one of his sisters might have survived. And he tried through the Red Cross to look for her, but she also had been killed. So it was a very hard time. I find it actually quite extraordinary that after that horrible 5-year period, you can understand, first of all, why my father would want to leave Cincinnati and move to New York for many reasons. He had some family in New York City who would come before the war. It was a better school, so many reasons, libraries and so on. But also when you're in a place that is associated with terrible grief and trauma, sometimes you want to move to a different place. My father also got married after the war. He started writing, and he wrote many books in a very short period of time. And I think it's actually extraordinary. From the time the war ended for the following 8 or 10 years, one book after another: The Earth is the Lord's, The Sabbath, Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, Man's Quest for God. These are major works. He also began working on a biography of the founder of Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, for which he had a Guggenheim, and hoped to finish that. That was never finished, but he was working on it, and we have his notes and preparations for that book. So I have to say that for me, it's important to recognize that he didn't collapse into despair. He didn't withdraw from the world. As he said, there are 3 ways to respond: silence, through tears, and by turning your sorrow into a song. And I think that's what he did with his books.
Okay. Thank you for that moving description of those 5 years. As you said, he married. He married Sylvia Strauss, a gifted pianist from Cleveland in 1946. Um, can you give us a glimpse of his home life and his family's religious life as they got married and began their life together? And then we'll get into some of the books you mentioned and some of the things he did, some of the broad contributions to the American project itself.
Okay. Well, my father and mother were well suited in the sense that my mother wanted to spend her days practicing the piano, and my father wanted to spend his days studying and writing at his desk. And so they were very compatible. My father went to his office in the mornings. Uh, some days he had classes to teach. My mother was at the piano. Neither one was particularly interested in entertainment. My father said there's a difference between entertainment and celebration. And he knew how to celebrate when something wonderful happened, when it was a birthday or an engagement or something great. He celebrated. But passive entertainment was not appealing to him at all. So my parents were together again at the end of the day for dinner, and then back at the piano and the desk. Um, we, as a family, occasionally would be invited to the home of a colleague of my father's from the seminary on Shabbat. And sometimes we would invite guests on Shabbat. More often, so Friday night, we wouldn't have guests. We didn't go to the synagogue Friday nights. We had dinner and we read. My father on the Sabbath only read works that were Hebrew books, classical religious texts. On Shabbat morning, we went to the synagogue. We came home. We had lunch. It was actually rather fun at lunch with a lot of humor, joking. And then my parents would take a nap for about 2 hours, which meant I had to be quiet. And I'm an only child, and that was difficult. And then they woke up. Very often in those days when I was little, Ellie Wiesel, who was not yet married, and lived down the street on Riverside Drive, would come over and take a walk with my father. And then they would come back and we would have tea. Tea was at 4 p.m. And sometimes my father would invite students of his to come for tea. So we may have 6 or 8 students at the table, and we would have high tea with lovely china teacups and coffee cake, cheese and crackers. And my father would ask the students to talk about themselves, what they were studying, where they came from, their families. So that was fun. And then when Shabbat was over, early in the, of course, in the winter, later in the summer, but we would then pray and then make Havdalah. There's a rumor going around that has appeared in a couple of books that once we were about to make Havdalah and there was a knock at the door and it was Martin Luther King and he came in and held a Havdalah candle and that never happened.
Okay. Okay. And Havdalah, give our
Uh,
listeners an explanation of.
Havdalah is the prayer at the end of the Sabbath where you hold a candle and smell spices and there's some singing at the end to say goodbye to the Sabbath.
Okay. But MLK never came to do that with your father.
No.
Okay.
And believe me, if he had, I would have been thrilled, and I would be thrilled to tell you about that, but it didn't happen. There are a lot of stories, But at the end of the day, after Havdalah, when the Sabbath was over, my father went back to his desk and my mother went to the piano. In the summers, we usually would go to Los Angeles for 2 months because my mother's family lived there and because my father hated hot weather. Hated it. And so do I. The hot, humid New York weather. So we went to LA as soon as school was over and rented a house. My father, who couldn't drive, would go to the library at UCLA. My mother would drive him. My mother would be at home. We had a house with a piano. And then on Sundays in Los Angeles, my father was home, but we would go to the home of my uncle, my mother's older brother, who was a doctor and who also played the violin. And he had a big music room with 2 pianos that had sliding glass doors that faced the swimming pool. And so all day musicians would come over and they would play 2 piano music with piano trios, quartets, and so forth all day long from 10 in the morning until 6 in the evening. And then some of us would be out and swimming at the pool and listening to the music. It was wonderful. And in a way that was it was a kind of conclusion to the Sabbath also. It was the next day, so the Sabbath was over, but it felt like something of the spirit of the Sabbath was carried over into the music.
Okay. And was in New York, I guess, was synagogue a big part of family life?
Oh, yes, I mean, every Shabbat morning, we went to the synagogue unless somebody was not feeling well. Yes, of course.
And which synagogue was it?
Oh, we went to the synagogue where my father taught, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was in those days an Orthodox service with men and women sitting separately, and only men led the service. Sometimes I would say that the service was a bit dry, let's say, not a very passionate service,
Okay.
not very prayerful. And sometimes my father would go instead to a little shtibel, a little tiny Hasidic synagogue on the Upper West Side that was run by Rabbi Tziviak, an extraordinary person I sometimes went with him, but the women were upstairs and couldn't really see or do very much. But he went there because that's where people really prayed.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so now to one of his books. In 1951, he published The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man. Can you share with our listeners a very brief synopsis of it, and then its meaning and significance on the American religious landscape?
Well, my father called the Sabbath a palace in time. Said we Jews don't have buildings or places that we call holy. The Sabbath is holiness in time. And the challenge to us is how do we make the Sabbath a holy day? It doesn't come to us holy, we make it holy. Remember the Sabbath and make it holy. So, how do we do that? There are many, many elements involved, and it's not only the observance of Jewish law about the Sabbath, it's also the spirit we create. So, Jewish law is concerned with the Sabbath as a day of rest, of not working. But it's also about the Sabbath as a day of joy. So, how do we make it joyous? The Sabbath comes actually with a mood. Friday night is beautiful, it's warm, it's lovely. On the day, Saturday, we're at the synagogue, we come home, it's a little more lighthearted. After my parents took a nap, by the time it was time for tea, the afternoon was a little different. It was slightly melancholy, I would say, because the Sabbath was almost over. So the mood of the day varies. And that's, I think, part of Jewish tradition. I have to say, I don't take naps, but I do take a nap on Shabbat afternoon. It feels like it's something congenital. But um, Shabbat is also a day, my father said, where you don't light a fire, which means all the cooking is done ahead of time. But it also means, he said, that you don't light the fire of controversy. So certain topics we didn't discuss on Shabbat. We didn't talk about anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. We talked about things that were uplifting, that brought hope, that were inspiring. And that too is part of Shabbat. Nowadays, there's been a revival of interest in Shabbat. Sometimes people would just phone our house, people we didn't know. They would ask to speak to my father, and they would say, I read your book on the Sabbath, and I would like to observe the Sabbath. What should I do? And my father said, just light Shabbat candles. Start with that and see where it leads you. Because he also felt that there has to be a balance in a person's life. He was remarkably open to this. He said, look, not everybody can be Jewish in an Orthodox way. Doesn't go with their personality.
Hmm.
And he got this, in fact, from a Hasidic Rebbe, the Kotzker Rebbe, whom he wrote about. He wrote a 2-volume Yiddish book about the Kotzker. And the Kotzker said that Judaism has to be authentic to who you are. Now, how do you do that? First of all, you have to know who you are. So you first have to do a lot of self-exploration to understand who you are. But he says that Judaism has to be authentic to who you are, which means you can't be Jewish just by imitating other people. My father mentions this in his book, Man is Not Alone. He says to be Jewish like other people are Jewish, says that would be spiritual plagiarism. And so my father said we have to have different ways of being Jewish. It may be Orthodox, conservative, however you wish to call it. He was open to that. He understood that you can't expect everybody to be the same, and that Judaism has to be authentic to you.
Okay. Great. Okay, so let's move on. About a decade later, he was at the White House Conference on Children and Youth, and he said, quote, "The problem of our youth is not youth. The problem of our age is denial of transcendence, the vapidity of values, emptiness in the heart, the decreased sensitivity to the imponderable quality of the spirit, the collapse of communication between the realm of tradition and the inner world of the individual. Close quote. Why was he invited to this conference, and what phenomenon in the public square was he addressing?
Well, I don't know why he was invited, but I assume it's because people were reading his books, and I think because Reinhold Niebuhr, before I was ever born, wrote a review of Man is Not Alone in the New York Herald Tribune. This was 1949. That was full of praise for my father and his writings about religion. And I think that review also brought my father to a broader audience. Um, my parents were amazed by that review and deeply grateful. Uh, um,
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah.
they, my father admired Reinhold Niebuhr enormously and spoke at his funeral at Niebuhr's request, which I think is also something very American and very important. That the greatest Protestant theologian of the day, Reinhold Niebuhr, would ask a Jewish thinker to speak at his funeral.
Sure.
About that. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So, yes, you asked about that quotation.
Yes.
On page 1 of God in Search of Man, my father writes that religion declined in the modern age, not because of the challenges of science and philosophy, but because the religious message had become insipid. He used to tell sometimes rabbinical students or young rabbis in the late summer when they were preparing their sermons for the high holidays, remember that the people in the congregation, some of them are facing very difficult challenges. Maybe a terrible illness in the family. Maybe someone has died whom they love. Maybe a divorce. Maybe they've lost their business and their money. Keep that in mind. Don't give a silly sermon. Try to speak to those. What can you say to them? And I appreciate that because too often sermons, and not just in synagogues, sermons are insipid. They'll tell you, well, the family is very important. Well, I know the family is important. I need something more than that. How do I handle despair? What do I do when I'm unable to sense God's presence? Where I feel I can't pray? Help me. And that, in fact, is what my father writes about in his very important article, No Religion is an Island. And he says, we as Jews and Christians, Muslims, people of different faiths, we shouldn't come together to talk about our doctrines. Nothing a Jew says about Jesus will ever be satisfactory to a Christian, obviously. So why discuss that? Let's look instead at a different level, the level of religiosity, of piety, of prayer. How can we help each other? How can we help each other cultivate devotion to God? Help each other in moments of despair? When we have difficulty reading the Psalms, how can we help each other? We all have the same problems that we face, religious problems. That's where we need to come together. May I just reminisce for one moment?
Please.
In those days, it was very unusual for Catholic priests, monks, nuns to come to a Jewish home on Shabbat. And I remember as a child when my father would invite priests and nuns to our home for Shabbat dinner. And they would come to our home. And it was clear to me, even as a child, that this was the first time they had been to a Jewish home. And certainly for Shabbat. And they would come to the table and stand at the table, as we said, prayers, my father would make Kiddush, Hamotzi. And I could tell that it was a very deeply moving experience for them, very religious experience. And I am sure that for them, it was also a moment when they suddenly realized that they couldn't believe that my father would not go to heaven. It was a moment when they realized that they had something to learn about God from a Jew. And that's what's so extraordinary. My father didn't talk to them about anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, any of those kinds of issues. Father just showed them what it is to pray as a Jew. And they were deeply moved.
Well said. Thank you for sharing that particular story about their visits. Moving on to another book, The Prophets, published in 1962. Heschel wrote, I don't believe he wrote in this book, but about prophets, he wrote, quote, "The prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he is bowed and stunned at man's fierce greed," close quote. Can you tell us about the book and what it said and its influence uh, in America?
So the book, The Prophets, this was a book my father wrote in English, but of course the core of it is his doctoral dissertation from Germany. He translated the dissertation into English, but he also expanded it greatly. And that book, that book appeared in English at the height of the civil rights movement. Andy Young told me that everybody had a copy of the paperback in their hip pocket and took it with them when they went to prison. The book was inspiring. And just keep in mind what it meant for my father to come from Nazi Germany, where he was studying with Protestant theologians, some of them who became Nazis. Protestant theologians, some of whom said that the so-called Old Testament is a Jewish book and should be thrown out of the Christian Bible. Some of whom said Jesus was not a Jew, Jesus was an Aryan, a German, and so forth. And he came to America. And first there's Reinhold Niebuhr praising my father's work. And then there's Dr. King making the Hebrew Bible the centerpiece of the civil rights movement. The Exodus, Moses, the prophets, Amos, the motto that's in Montgomery at the Civil Rights Memorial is a verse from Amos: "Let justice roll down like water and righteousness as a mighty stream." That's remarkable. Dr. King, first of all, loved the Hebrew Bible in a way that you would not find among German Protestants, I must say. But he also made the civil rights movement an ecumenical movement. So my father was right there. It could have been very different. But that's also something about the Black church, the centrality of Exodus, of the prophets, of the Hebrew Bible. And so my father met Dr. King in January of 1963 in Chicago at a conference on religion and race, where they both gave keynote lectures, and they bonded. What brought them together? People from such different backgrounds. God, the Bible, the love of the Bible, the way they thought religiously. They used similar language in their speeches. I noticed both Dr. King and my father would say, the God of the Bible is not the unmoved mover of Aristotle, impassive, unaffected by anything, all-powerful, all-knowing, but rather the most deeply moved God of the Bible. God responds to us, and that's the central point my father makes in his book on the prophets. He uses the term divine pathos. He means, in Hebrew rabbinic idea, tzorach gavoha. There is a divine need. God needs us. And we have a responsibility. to make God's presence in the world, make it tangible, make more of expand the presence of God. And also, my father said, when I hurt another human being, I injure God. And when I help another person, I give strength to God. And that's why he said, after he returned from the march in Selma, my father said, I felt my legs were praying, because marching for civil rights was prayer.
Thank you for bringing us to that point. When he marched with Martin Luther King in 1965, and also mentioning that he first met Dr. King at this religion and race conference.
So when my father and Dr. King met in January of 1963, they immediately started working together in various ways. They gave talks together. Dr. King came to speak to Jewish groups. He spoke out on issues that were of concern to my father, such as freedom for the Jews in the Soviet Union. And then in 1965, March of 65, first there was an attempted march from Selma to Montgomery that was led um, by SNCC, actually. Um, and so if you've been to Selma, you know that when you leave Selma, you go on the Pettus Bridge. Pettus was a Confederate general, by the way. And the bridge is curved. So when the marchers came to the top of the bridge, they looked down, and there were the Alabama state troopers with gas masks and sticks and clubs, and they charged the marchers and beat them. And we saw that on television. I think that's well known that that evening, Judgment at Nuremberg was being shown on television in America, and the movie was interrupted um, with film footage of the marchers being beaten. So it's known as Bloody Sunday. President Johnson saw it also and gave a speech in support of voting rights, and he ended the speech by saying, "We shall overcome." Dr. King was in Selma. He was staying at the home of a wonderful family, Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson and their daughter, Joanna, whom I'm friendly with, in their home. And then there was became the third attempt, which was in some sense also a celebration that Congress was going to pass the Voting Rights Act. And we received a telegram from Dr. King on that Friday afternoon asking him to join the march on Sunday. And it was a very busy afternoon. My father came home from his office early, packed a suitcase, and it was a nervous Shabbat. And that evening, after Havdalah, my mother and I went down the elevator with my father to see him off to the airport. And I remember when he kissed me goodbye, holding that moment very consciously and deliberately, because I didn't know if he would come back. It was dangerous. But he did come back. He said that Dr. King told him it was the greatest day of his life. My father wrote in his diary that he felt something holy in that march. He told me that a little boy came over to him as my father had a beard and asked him, "Are you Santa Claus?" Which my father thought was very sweet. He brought home the lei that one of the marchers from Hawaii had brought to the front line of marchers. But he said, I felt my legs were praying. And that was very moving. Dr. King and my father continued working together, lecturing together. The question then came whether Dr. King should speak out against the war in Vietnam. because that would, in fact, damage his relationship with Congress and with the president. So, was it a safe thing to do? That was the next issue on the table, so to speak.
Yes.
And eventually, Dr. King did speak out against the war at Riverside Church in 1967, exactly a year to the day before he was assassinated. And I was present that evening. My father introduced Dr. King. Dr. King gave a very important speech. There's a documentary by Tavis Smiley about the speech, and that was an important occasion as well.
We are going to get to your father's work with the Vietnam War. So thank you for bringing us to that. Let me ask one question before we get there. And by the way, thank you for the story about the moving story with some new details, at least for me, about your father and marching with Dr. King and Selma. Can you give us a brief description, as you understand it, of your father's involvement in the Second Vatican Council in the mid 1960s before we move on to Vietnam and then end?
So, um, first of all, I should say my father was very well read in Christian theology and the history of Christianity, the church fathers through modern Protestant theologians. He knew that material. I have notebooks with his handwritten notes that he took reading that material. So he knew a lot about Christianity. He was obviously also learned much about it in his years in Berlin at the university, and because it was Protestant theologians who were the scholars of the Hebrew Bible. There was no such thing as Jewish studies at a German university in those days. My father became involved in the Second Vatican Council on the question of Nostra Aetate. It's very interesting. There's a historian who wrote that when Pope John the 23rd announced that the council would be convened, he asked bishops all over the world to send him a memorandum, what they would like to see discussed. And you can imagine there were hundreds of thousands of pages that were submitted. Not one said a word about discussing Catholic relations with Jews and Judaism. So the topic itself was not promoted from outside, but became a topic. And Pope John the 23rd appointed Cardinal Bea, Augustine Cardinal Bea, to be in charge of that document, that what Nostra Aetate, the document about the church's relationship with other religions. Now, Cardinal Bea was originally from Germany and had studied also at the University of Berlin. And I discovered recently that one of his professors was Eugen Mittwoch, who was also one of my father's professors and someone that my father talked about often when I was a child. So I was very struck by that. Now, Cardinal Bea was older, so he was at the university about 15 years before my father arrived, but nonetheless. But one of the things that Cardinal Bea wrote about was that when God makes a covenant, God does not withdraw it. God doesn't change his mind or have a change of heart. So the covenant with the Jews stands eternally as God's covenant. That's important. The American Jewish Committee was involved with the Second Vatican Council and arranged for my father to meet with Cardinal Bea and with other officials. Cardinal Bea came to New York City at one point, and my father met with him and brought him a copy of the Midrash on the Song of Songs, um, because it was a text that Cardinal Bea was familiar with. Um, and that's a Midrash that also has to do with the question of revelation. And they had a little bit of correspondence as well. For my father, what was important, among other things, he had a memorandum, and one of the key principles for my father was that the church should not try to missionize Jews, convert Jews. He said that trying to convert Jews would be a kind of spiritual fratricide. That was extremely important. And when word came out that one of the drafts, the second draft of Nostra Aetate, not the final draft, but the second draft, included language about mission to the Jews, my father was very upset. And I remember he said to the press, I would rather go to Auschwitz than give up my faith. It's a very strong statement. It frightened me, the idea of my father going to Auschwitz. But the third and final draft eliminated that. It eliminated the claim the Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. It also talked about eliminating anti-Semitism and eliminating negative teachings about Jews. And instead, what my father wanted was that Catholics should appreciate the holiness of Judaism. That was important. And so my father, in that sense, was successful. And I think some of it was the exposure of Catholics to Judaism,
Right.
such as coming to our home for Shabbat dinner. Not arguments about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, but to see the holiness,
Right.
to see that Catholics can be inspired by Jewish holiness to become better Catholics.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. That will be of great interest to our listeners. So let's move on to Vietnam quickly. Your father was the national co-chairman of the organization called Clergy and Laity Concerned About Vietnam. And he once said that, quote, to speak about God and remain silent on Vietnam is blasphemous, close quote. Can you paint us a full picture of his anti-Vietnam War activism?
Yes. Well, in some ways, first of all, my father, when he came home at the end of the day, we would have dinner around 6 o'clock. And at 7 o'clock was Walter Cronkite with the news. And he listened attentively and, of course, read the New York Times every day. My father was very concerned about Vietnam, about this war that was dragging on, that involved so much bombing of civilian homes. There was a professor at Columbia University named Seymour Melman who had received information that the United States was committing war crimes in Vietnam, bombing civilians, killing civilians. And he brought that material to the attention of some theologians, academics, intellectuals, journalists. My father was horrified by the evidence that was presented. And in the fall of 1965, he and a few other clergy held a press conference saying that committing war crimes was absolutely unacceptable. At the end of the press conference, which involved my father and Protestants and Catholics, one of the journalists said, well, that's fine that you're speaking out, but now what are you going to do about it? And my father said, we're going to form an organization, Clergy Concerned About Vietnam. And the others turned to him and said, really, we are? Wasn't planned, but they did. And it opened in October of 1965. They had the first meeting on a Sunday afternoon. I was there at that meeting because my father had to babysit me that day. My mother was busy. And at that meeting, my father was present. John Bennett, the president of Union Theological Seminary, was involved, and also Pastor Richard Newhouse, at the time a Lutheran pastor in Brooklyn. Later, he became Catholic priest. They had an empty chair for Father Daniel Berrigan, who was opposed to the war and had been sent out of the country by his Jesuit superior. So this meeting then, and also William Sloane Coffin, who was the Protestant chaplain at Yale University. And actually, it was Bill Coffin who found the right person to be the executive director, Reverend Richard Fernandez. He became the director. They had an office in New York City at a building, the Interchurch Center on the Upper West Side, housed offices for various church organizations. And they organized demonstrations, and they reached out to clergy all over the country, rabbis, priests, ministers, to form chapters, to speak out against the war, to tell their congregations what was actually happening in Vietnam. And then came the question, should Dr. King speak out against the war? It was a big question. And I will tell you that Political issues were discussed at our dinner table, but not as political. Really, they were moral issues. And there was a moral question. Was it the right thing to encourage Dr. King to speak out against the war? What's our moral responsibility to the civil rights movement? So finally, Dr. King did start to speak out against the war, 66, 67. And it was, in fact, Reverend Richard Fernandez who organized this major event at Riverside Church, which was packed with people. People couldn't even get in, and the church is massive. And Dr. King came. My father introduced him. Henry Steele Commager was there. Dr. King spoke out against the war. And the next day, he was attacked by everyone, all the newspapers, all the civil rights leaders. You shouldn't do this. Don't interfere. But he did.
You certainly did. Okay. Thank you for that. Susanna, what did your father? There's one more question after this one, but I wanted to slip this in here because you do a lot about Islam. What did your father think and write about Islam in America, if anything? I don't remember reading much about this, but since you are heavily involved, I thought I'd ask you this question because it's certainly one. Islam is a question in the public square. Absolutely.
Well, first of all, my father read classical Arabic. And when he was a student in Berlin, he published some articles about medieval Jewish philosophers who wrote in Arabic and who were influenced by Islamic theology. My father felt that actually, under the influence of Islam, certain new ideas entered Judaism. For example, that God is uh, immutable, all powerful, but unaffected. That became an important idea for some Jewish philosophers writing in Arabic under Islamic influence, for example. So, for instance, Friday is a day of prayer for Muslims, but they would not say that what Jews say, what the Bible says, that God rested on the seventh day, because in Islam, you wouldn't have the idea that God would need to rest. Doesn't make sense. God is all powerful and doesn't need to rest. Whereas in the Bible, for Jews, for Christians, there it is. So there's some differences, but the influences also come into Judaism as of course, it was Muslim theologians and philosophers who translated Greek philosophy into Arabic and transmitted it also then to Jewish thinkers. So there was an intimacy and certain directions developed in Jewish thought. My father was always obviously aware of Islam and aware of the scholarship that Jews, especially in Germany, but in Europe in general, the scholarship that Jews had written about Islam, especially about the Quran, and the parallels between rabbinic ideas and the Quran. So when Jewish scholars began to read the Quran uh, and write about it in the 1830s, they were amazed to find passages in the Quran that were word for word the same as they appear in the Mishnah and the Midrash, classical rabbinic writings. So my father was certainly aware of all of that. Islam in America, there's very little. He had very little contact with Muslim theologians. That was not developed in those days. My father died in 1972, unfortunately. But I can tell you, for instance, that one of my father's books was Who is Man, was translated into Urdu by a professor of Islamic theology at a university in Pakistan and in Islamabad. And that the same book is of interest to somebody in California, someone from Iran, Muslim, who's thinking about translating it into Farsi. So I think that's pretty amazing.
Sure. Right. Okay. Thank you. So, last question, Susanna. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the topic, your father, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Well, I would say, first of all, that the issues that concern my father are still with us: poverty, war, cruelty to one another, indifference. My father writes in his book on the prophets, the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. I think my father would be deeply concerned about certain developments in the American public square where we find a lack of dignity and, in fact, political leaders who mock people for being disabled, for example, with an audience that cheers instead of walking away or booing or saying that's disgusting. People lose their own dignity when they deny the dignity of other human beings. So my father would be very deeply concerned about corruption, about a lack of a spirit of generosity, and certainly he would be deeply concerned about anti-Semitism. My father spent time in Israel and has written about Zionism. He would be deeply upset with the direction that has been taken by the current government of the State of Israel. He hoped for a State of Israel that would be quite different, and a country that would exemplify Jewish religious and moral principles, but also a country that would not be the target of destruction by so many other states and terrorist organizations that want to wipe out Israel. That would horrify him and did horrify him during his lifetime. So I would say when my father said that racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil, he spoke with passion, and he would speak with passion today, as we all should. And the issues that he addressed are issues that are still with us. Economic justice, racial justice. So I think we have a lot to do. I think my father and that magnificent photograph from Selma shouldn't just be a source of pride of, look how great Abraham Heschel was, but it should be a challenge. I don't know if we're even worthy of that photograph. It is a photograph we should look at and feel ashamed that we haven't done enough.
Okay, thank you. You have the last word. We have been talking with Susanna Heschel, the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, Chair of the Jewish Studies Program, and a faculty member of the Religion Department, and, importantly, daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please write a review. Susanna, thank you so very much for being with us and helping us understand the American Project better by comprehending, at least a little bit, the life and times of your father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. It was informative, moving, and enlightening. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
I did very much. Thank you so much.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.